Okay, what are you guys seeing now? Yeah, that's it. Good. Okay. So people have probably heard the phrase implementer's guide or implementation guide a lot. And those can be a number of different things. Typically, I'm old, you know, and back in the day when we were dealing with a lot of flat file syntaxes, an implementation guide was the thing you hired IBM Global Services to write for you against whatever weird flat file syntax you had that told you specifically, you know, what of the possible syntactical elements, the little segments and codes you would use. And that idea has been carried forward into the XML world and into a lot of other standards. And we're carrying it, I think, a little bit further with CDI. And I want to talk about the scope of what we think is in an implementation guide, because it is far more than just a subset of the syntax. And that, so this is kind of an ambitious summary of what could be in an implementation guide and what the information set is that we want to convey to users. Will we have time to lay this all out this week? Probably not. So the first slide I'm going to talk about, this is the outline. I want to talk about the deliverables first, and then kind of the need and some of the features of this. There's a common problem with standards. So this is a picture of, actually, compared to Lifecycle, this looks kind of small and neat, right? What do you think, Darren? He says it looks like the SESTA metadata model. So now we get to see. You won't hurt him. You can if you want. So Karsten is claiming that he's not responsible, and Darren's not responsible. So none of them are responsible, but we are responsible for this thing. That's CDI. And the problem we have, as with many big and particularly domain standards do this, you've got a lot of different classes with a lot of relationships and properties, and no one's going to use all of them. And I'm going to be a little self-critical here because I had a lot to do with the development of DDI lifecycle. I think one of the places we failed badly, and profiles were the closest we got, which Darren talked about earlier, or Karsten talked about earlier, is the ability to formally declare a subset of that. And to operate within known bounds. And I think that didn't go far enough, honestly. And I feel like we want to carry that forward in both at the level of documentation and implementation guidance and as a formal expression of what is used and not used. Plus, we have the problem of not having, quote, official syntaxes for everything in DDI, CDI. We expect communities to vary in the way that they do syntax implementations, which adds another layer of complexity. So, I'm being very nice here. He's just saying what. He could be saying something similar, with add a couple words there. But most implementers really want to get on with their job, to implement the thing, to know that it's compliant and will interoperate and be done. And that's the goal. And so I think it's useful to bear that in mind. When we're looking at deliverables from this workshop, I would really like to come out of here with a draft, a complete first draft of a methodology for doing implementation guides. Now that is, I believe, hopelessly ambitious. But based on who we have here and the examples that we're working with, I think we can identify some portions of the scope I'm going to describe and really get into what would be useful to implementers. And this is not an academic exercise. This is very much a handbook for implementers to take and use when they're looking at their communities and what kind of fair data sharing they want to do. So I think there's a number of components to this. Fair means, what is from the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Like Fuji, we were bitching about Fuji earlier. Fuji is one community's view of what fair is. There are many others. And the more you get into talking to different communities, the more you realize that fair means a lot of different things to different people. And we're talking about formalizing that. So we kind of have to explore what is a, quote, community and what is, quote, fair. Because those are things that are typically not completely defined and that varies across communities. I think templates are a critical sort of requirement in a lot of different areas. And we'll be looking at some of those for things like syntax representation and subsetting the overall model. Something that gets very interesting is what happens when you start engaging with other standards. We've been talking about DCAT and schema.org, for example. Where's the overlap? What of the metadata in DCAT do you want to carry in a CDI instance? Because you can't express a lot of it, but there should be connections, right? And similarly with schema.org. There's a thing called variable in schema.org. It doesn't tell you a lot, but it exists. How do you use it, right? The questions like that are that's the level you need to get to. And so it would be nice to draft some portions of this week. Basically, the need is pretty clear. We have a big model, and we know no one's going to use all of it. So that means subsetting. It's not a monolithic specification. It's not tied to a single platform or technology, but in context, within a community, it will be. And so that's part of what we have to cover. Again, how does it align with other standards? I think I mentioned basically all of this at this point. We have some examples to work from. One of them is what you presented this morning, Karsten, is the sort of CESDA example. I think that shows what a community needs to do to achieve interoperability, right? And that's a big challenge, even when you already have a standard that everybody's agreed to use. And even when you're all using a pretty similar toolkit, like Nestar was for CESDA for a long time. There's an initiative that Akim and Hilda and I have been involved with around the Helmholtz metadata collaboration. Pierluigi is actually an organizer of another meeting this week. He'll be with us next week, but he may or may not have some time to drop in and talk to us about this. If not, we can show you the work that we're doing with them. Helmholtz is a big research institute in Germany, very, very broad. It's not domain specific. And they're doing a prototype trying to figure out how they share metadata. Their initial take on this has been sort of schema.org using JSON-LD embedded in catalog entries around data sets, but they're looking at driving things to the variable level and doing some more on-demand conversion of data sets into useful formats for people in that community. They're looking at DDI, CDI, and what we're doing is going through and mapping that into OWL, right? Is selecting classes and doing OWL descriptions of those classes for use in that community. That's a pretty interesting case. The NGIS, NGSI, whatever it is, Pierre-Antoine, that's another project where we're sort of looking at, okay, here are the data sets, here's what's being described in that standard. How do you map DDI, CDI against that? Because you're not using a lot of it. You're just using, we've mostly focused on the structures for aggregate data up to this point in that project, and I'm a little involved with that, but the other guys will be coming and talking. I'm sure we have other examples we can think of. So hopefully people out there who are attending virtually can hear the airplanes going overhead, because they're pretty loud, actually. There is not, DDI CDS is not a production spec yet, and there's no complete implementation. There are use cases, things that we have implemented to test parts of the model as it was being developed. That does not amount to a reference implementation. And so there isn't one. And that kind of means that we're writing implementation guides for something that doesn't really exist yet, right? So we're writing a care and maintenance guide for a unicorn, basically. That's going to change, but I think we can take a first step in an important way in nailing some of this down now and trying to lay out what the goal for the future is as we get more implementation. Whatever we do this week is not going to be the final word, but it could be a really good start to something. I think looking at the functional requirements is an interesting activity with DDI, CDI, because you have the differences around FAIR. You have often a very broad range of data types. We always use the phrase cross-domain. What does that actually mean? What is a domain, right? Can anyone give me a single good definition? Probably not. Is Shock, CESDA is a contributor to the Shock cluster in EOSC, right? Is Shock a domain? No, it's way bigger than that. Helmholtz is not a discipline in any meaningful sense. It's very cross-domain. I've been working a lot with sort of public health and epidemiology data. That is not a single domain. They have all of the problems of cross-domain within that, what we think of as a single domain. So I think the line around cross-domain data sharing blurs pretty badly when you start looking at real cases. But you guys, Darren, have, like the energy stuff that you're working with, that is clearly cross-domain, right?
Yeah, I think they're separate enough. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, energy readings and social science survey data are qualitatively different enough that that's unambiguous. But I agree, there are lots of grey areas.
Yeah. So that's anyway. We can look at different examples, but at the end of the day, we're looking at a lot of different types of data. We're looking at very often different applications producing and consuming the data, different analysis methods which have different requirements. And the other thing you see is that some communities define fair as, oh, it's got a DOI, it's fair, right? Is that actually fair? Not by my understanding of it, but every community has a different sort of target level that they think is achievable. And you want to encourage all of them to do it to the extent possible and to do it in the same way. But there will be different levels of maturity within different communities, and we have to recognize that. You know, we spent decades getting any kind of metadata around data for the purposes of being able to archive and repurpose it, right? That has been an uphill battle, a long fight. That's at a very different place in different communities. And we sort of have to recognize that and work with it. But I think part of the implementation guide has to be identifying what are you actually trying to achieve, because DDI, CDI could do more or less depending on what your goals are. I mean, I think we're talking about granular metadata with CDI, but even within that range, there are a lot of different things you could do. So some of the things that you want to do won't be supported by CDI, and you need also to be able to identify those. So I think this is kind of obvious, but it's worth thinking about up front. And I think it's worth giving guidance to implementers about how to define the goals of an implementation guide vis-a-vis the standard. Because they probably want to do that for all of the different technology interoperability they're aiming for, of which CDI will be a part. So we need to think about how to frame it within that larger picture. Selecting which classes of CDI are relevant is not an activity that we've done a lot of. We've done a little bit of it. The challenge becomes when you start getting into what we call the foundational metadata. So how do I describe a classification? The model in DDI, CDI is very, very complete. But if you're not actually managing classifications, you probably don't need 2/3 of it or 80% of it, right? There's a lot of detail there that most people won't care about. They may even say, oh, we're going to use SCOS and be done. And the way we view DDI, CDI, that's entirely legitimate. But you need to specify that that's what you're going to do within a community. So if you're going to use SCOS to handle your classifications, you know, good, bad, or indifferent as a choice, you need to specify that so that people understand what they're dealing with when they implement. And so I think there's a little nuance to the way that DDI, CDI gets subsetted. It's not as simple as going through a checklist and saying this one, this one, this one, this one. You have to think a little bit about how much of, you say we're going to use that class or we're going to use that portion of the model, but you have to subset even within that. And that, there are a lot of fields in DDI, CDI where you're making references to external vocabularies, where there are controlled vocabularies that are very domain specific. You have to agree on those things and agree on how they're going to be expressed. So there's a lot of work at that level that you need to do when you're picking and choosing things out of the model. I always think that something standards people like to do is to dictate what implementations will look like, because it makes their job as standards people easy, and they get to have the first word. That's very often an incredibly stupid thing to do when you expect people to adopt your standard, because they want it to be cheap and easy. And there are a number of strategies for balancing costs and sort of tool choices and implementation choices. I think we want to think about those, because what I'm seeing a lot of is, for instance, services around using particular expressions of particular kinds of metadata, and services that could be shared throughout a community. If everyone does the easy thing, which is to use a publicly available free service, they all do it the same way. So you solve the interoperability problem in some small way, and you also solve the implementer's problems as long as the tool, the service is built right. Approaches like that you have to think about. And the methodology we provide for doing implementation guides should provide for that kind of thinking. I don't know what that looks like necessarily, but I think you have to look at the cost of implementing and the cost of sort of providing tools to people. And there are other things in that space. I think we have to think a lot about syntax representation. No offense intended, Pierre-Antoine, but the RDF people are always like, oh, everyone's going to use RDF for everything. And reality has said, oh, really? Not, well, other people might do that, and then they go off and implement something else. I've been working a lot with the OMOP CDM. Those people are relational. They're deeply, deeply, deeply relational in their thinking. And they tried to implement RDM, and then they said, nah, no thanks, and went off and did something completely different. That's normal, right? And I think we can't have the presumption that RDF will be the workhorse here, or that XML will be the workhorse. And I think that's one of the things we want to look at and understand the potential complexities of that. On top of that comes the burden of training and getting people within a community to have the skill set to implement something that you've decided they need to use even though it's new. And I think in the case of RDF and Json LD, for instance, like you're talking about Json LD with this extension. How practical is it to use that approach? Because you have to ask that not just from a standards perspective, but from an implementer's perspective. I like the idea. It's really cool, but I'm not going to have to pay for it in some particular domain. And you have to think about those issues as well. And how well tooled and how well adopted will things be, how mainstream things will be. So you're all like shaking your heads and saying, you really want to specify a methodology for thinking about all of this? It's a big ask, I understand. I think this is the last one. With DDI lifecycle, we had the profiles, and that was a formalization that probably had some serious flaws. I think we've discussed that a little bit over the coffee break. But there was a way of doing it that people could take and use. We need to think about how you formalize the aspects of an implementation guide. But not all of it needs to be formalized. It should all be documented. But some formalizations might be really useful, and we should think about what those are. How do I subset a model? UML gives you ways of doing that that are pretty complicated unless you're a serious modeler, that may or may not be sufficient for what we're doing or appropriate for what we're doing. And we need to ask ourselves that. And then all these other aspects I'm talking about in terms of syntax binding, in terms of the choice of other standards and those alignments. Can we specify those things in a formal way that makes it easier for implementers to use, so they're unambiguous? That's a big question, and I don't pretend to know the answer to that in every case. We need also to think about dissemination, training, what is the governance and maintenance of an implementation guide? The minute you write one of these things, you get a new user who says, well, that's great, except this part here, plus I need you to support these two other things. How do you deal with that as a community? Those are new questions to a lot of people who are approaching FAIR. And in some communities, that's they have organizations and governance and decision-making processes and whatever. Not everywhere. And I think it's worth thinking about, is there guidance that we could give communities who are do not already have pre-existing governance for these things? So here's a question for Darren and Karsten. CESDA, good at governance for technical artifacts? Be honest.
I'm passing over to Karsten.
So that was a no comment. Yeah.
Darren did not want to comment because of fear of trouble with me for some reason. I mean, we're struggling with it on all ends, right? I mean, there's hard to put it in a single answer, but I mean, technical artifacts, how do you version things? Where do you know what is the latest version? Who releases what when? We just recently had a case. I was mentioning our vocabulary, our validator earlier. And, well, we had new profiles, we added the new profiles, we made a new release. But we only released the application, and there was not a release of the underlying library. So now in the API, you have a version mismatch if you're asking for the version of the tool and for the version of the library, which is something we did not realize in advance. And that's caused people to be confused. So on a very basic level, there are lots of problems with managing these artifacts and knowing what's where and what's the latest version. And that's...
Who decides? Who do you talk to fix the problem? Who says it?
Yeah, I'd probably tell you whom to talk to for the concrete problem, but we don't have a clear understanding of how to make it. I mean, we have some documents that actually say how this release process should have gone and what should have happened, but that case wasn't caught because the release process only covered the web interface we see, and not that if you update this, you also have to update the library, for which there was no need, because it was only the drop-down in the website that changed. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think at a granular level, you know, the governance and processes are very good in terms of publishing out to Bitbucket and branch management, etc. I think some of the problems come with, you know, decoupled artifacts, so versioning the profiles against versioning the tools that actually use them. And I think an ongoing problem is like you say, who's in charge? You know, who is the final design authority? Because you have a very disparate mix of end users who don't really understand XML syntax but know what they want from the profiles, and then slightly more nerdy people who actually write the profiles. So yeah, I think it's just looking at this as an ecosystem and not just individual artifacts, is what I would say.
Okay, point made. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here when I talk about governance and maintenance, basically. But I think it covers everything you do. You have to think about it in terms of the process and the living process. And with CDI, we're trying to do a better job of that than DDI has done in the past. And I'm not going to say that DDI did it very well. I think we've gotten better over the years. I don't think we understood the depth of the problem. And CESDA is a huge user of DDI specs, right? And I'm not sure that has even always been an easy communication with the Alliance. So I feel like there are a lot of different levels to that problem, but it's an important one. That's basically what I wanted to get into here. We're not even close to lunch, you guys. So I don't know what we want to do with this. Do you have any questions or thoughts about any of what I've covered here? This was really designed to just describe the scope of what this group is going to be doing. I'd be really curious to hear what people think would be most useful as a deliverable from this week. What do people, because we're going to publish this big model, you know, this thing. We're going to publish that box. And that box is going to have field level documentation and, you know, not a lot else. It's just going to be a specification of that thing. Where do we expect people to start, right?
You can bring up the slide where the goals, what we think are the goals. The slide.
No, I want to hear what they say.
Yeah, okay.
I could, but I have to switch slide decks if I do that, Hilda. What is the most useful thing with a brand new spec to get people to take it and make sense out of it from an implementation perspective? What part of the scope that I just presented? Like if we were to, Darren.
I would say start from the XML document rather than the schema. For an end user, they want to know, you know, I have some data that I need to share with the world. How do I do that with this particular schema? Secondly, I'd say don't overestimate the level of data modeling expertise or XML expertise there is out there. There are a core number of people. I mean, I can only speak really for CESDA and that community. There are a small number of very good people, but the majority of users, I would say, would be intimidated by a diagram like that, and their first reaction would probably say, I think I'll stick with Codebook, thank you very much. So I think real world use cases, I think examples of markup, you know, how do I mark up a variable in DDI, CDI? I mean, that might apply to lifecycle as well, but you cannot have enough working examples of how to do this. And I think that's the way in. I think presenting people just with a spec and saying, read this and get on with it is a really high barrier to entry.
Maybe Hilda, we could go back and look. We did a CDI webinar recently. I don't know if you guys saw this on, and one of the examples we were showing was the Helmholtz example. But I'd like to show you that and sort of talk you through what we did with that at some stage, because we absolutely started with a data set. We said, here's a Pangea data set. It's oceanographic data. What is it? What classes do we need to just describe the data? Because they know that they want to do that. And so I feel like that approach probably makes sense. Any other thoughts about this? Any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's similar what Darren said, right? We have our codebook files. How and why should we put them in a CDI document, and who can use it? So what's the benefit of taking a codebook document, making it a CDI document? How does that help me connect to OpenAir? That may go beyond what you just mentioned, but I mean, I said earlier, my problem is I need to add all of this other metadata into the metadata and then connect it to OpenAir. Is CDI the solution to do it, and if so, how?
So you talk to technical people about implementation and they turn into marketing guys. It's amazing. They're like, yeah, but what's the business case? No, I joke, but that's serious. The problem with a cross-domain spec is the reason you're doing it is not to help yourself, it's to help other people on some level. And you have to communicate why that's a good idea. Fair depends on the goodness of, the kind-heartedness of strangers, which is like a super unreliable thing, right? Pierre-Antoine.
Actually, that reminds me of problems that we have in the RDF world, convincing people to use RDF. I pointed out how RDF is perceived as more complex because it makes a lot of things explicit, which people feel they don't really need. But again, as you very well framed it, it's not for themselves, it's for helping other people using their data. So there's a lot of parallel here. Also, maybe, would that make sense? As I said, I'm very new to the whole DDI thing. Would that make sense to reframe codebook as a specific profile of CDI? And would that help people to make the move?
Yes, it would. One of the first things that I did looking at CDI and implementation as the model came together was to start doing a little thought experiment based actually on the Searle example from the EOSC report that we did, Darren. That Akim and I and Simon from Codata wrote a report as part of EOSC talking about the potential applications of DDI CDI. One of the things we looked at was, we talked to Darren about the Smart Energy Research Laboratory, and as a way of identifying the metadata you need to actually do an integration, potentially in an automated way. Like, what do you actually need to know? And so I took that example as a sort of thought experiment and started looking at that and saying, okay, I have a codebook instance for some of this data. How much of what I need to express in CDI to support the integration already exists in codebook? And the truth is most of it does, right? There are a few bits of information you need to add to that to enhance its integratability. But things like what roles are the variables playing within the structure that data set happens to have. You know what the variables are. You know how they're represented. That's all in codebook. Can I reduce the added metadata to the smallest possible amount so that I could write a program, get a configuration file from the user, and produce the CDI programmatically? We're looking at this also with Dataverse, actually, as a part of that use case. And those kinds of questions I think are really important, because if people have codebook today, and you can say, here's a tool, go through this little form interface for each data set and specify which variables are playing these roles, and then hit the button, and boom, you've got CDI. That would make things much easier for people and enhance adoption a lot. And then they would have examples from their own data which they already understand. And so I feel like there are approaches that we need to think about. and then figure out what can the alliance say about DDI, CDI to help people. You know, we don't really publish tools, but how could we recommend tools to people to help them implement? I think all those questions come together in some way. I don't know what that is, but I guess what I'm hearing is you need to make the business case, and then you need to reduce the cost, like as much as possible immediately based on what people have. I don't know if the primary users of CDI will be DDI users, actually. I think that's one major audience for it, but what about other people? What about other data holdings? And how do we sell this to people who are not in the social science domain? You know, that's another question. Is their business case different? Who wants the social science data anyway? Does anybody care about social science data? Hilda does.
Yes, and now you also have all these upcoming data integration projects, right? For data from different domains being integrated together, and that is new for everybody, and that's the main purpose of CDI, and we need to keep that in mind as well, because that will be up and coming and very soon also.
I'm curious, because I work in a lot of COVID-driven stuff. There was a lot of money in COVID, and everybody's like, fair, COVID. Like the grand challenges, climate change, COVID, these are the things that are getting funding right now. And the nice thing about that is that if people say, oh, this project is going to make our data more fair, then the executives can sign off on that because, you know, the people they report to understand that fair is a good thing. So the business case is, I think, can be made in that respect. What about economic data? Like SOAP, that's important data. Is it important in terms of like grand challenges? I know people are looking at COVID and saying, what are the economic impacts of COVID? I know people are researching that. Do you run into that at all? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, actually we are doing some surveys on COVID too, but we don't release the data yet. That's another problem, I would say. I think if you want to use data of different domains in one analysis, there are at least two possibilities. You can, the people can look at both data sets and think how they can be combined. Yeah? That's the traditional way, and the other way could be, yeah, if we tell the users via metadata how the data sets can be combined. And I'm somehow a little skeptical about the second option, because you want to structure things that don't exist yet. Yeah? And researchers have to think about and develop, and therefore I'm a little skeptical on that. Yeah.
I think you're right about the danger of designing something that doesn't exist yet, and extending the theme of having a business case. It's almost like this early adopter problem. Like with the telephone, who's going to be the first person to use the telephone? But you're going to need a second person to make it worthwhile. So I think, I know there's a lot of talk about interoperability and EOSC, but I still don't, until there's that killer app that says, look, this is what you can do in a cross-domain setting with, for example, DD-CDI, something you really couldn't do before, and it's really value added, then it's going to be difficult to persuade people to jump from other standards.
I love documenting unicorns. Here's the problem, and I love quoting this study. PricewaterhouseCoopers was hired by the European Commission to assess the cost to Europe of not having fair data. And my favorite factoid, DDI was mentioned in a footnote. I've spent my entire life working on a footnote in a PricewaterhouseCoopers report, but it was a really good footnote because it looked at the importance of structured metadata in terms of the overall cost of data sharing to European research. And my favorite fact in that report was that 80% of the cost of large research projects is spent integrating data and cleaning data the old-fashioned way. 80%. That's insane. Like if you can go to people and say, look, you could be doing twice as much research and half as much messing around in Stata to use the data, I think you can sell that. That's a
No, I agree it's the same, but don't underestimate the kind of corporate inertia around.
that's corporate inertia is a big deal, Darren. I guess what I'm thinking though is that you have FAIR as a marketing tool. People recognize FAIR, they recognize the importance of the grand challenges and data integration. If ever there was a time to come up with a better way of doing things, I think you have the numbers behind you. There is that problem of trying to create a standard for practice which doesn't happen yet. And I think with CDI we are looking at that, honestly. That's not a happy picture, but you have to start somewhere. So how do you sell the telephone? You kidnap somebody, give their mother a telephone, and then take them somewhere far away. Like, that may not be the best plan. But I think there's lots of pieces to put together here. To speak to your comment, Knut, there's a very interesting thing, and this came up when I was chatting with Pierre-Antoine yesterday. There's been a lot of work by ontologists within domains. There are lots and lots, some good, some bad, but there are a lot of them. In the RDF world produced this idea that, we can do ontologies, we can formalize them, we can begin to work with them, put this stuff on the web. And when you're integrating data and the semantics are mismatched, which is often the case, you come up with a set of variables you want to join on. How do we talk about geography? How do we talk about time? If you can programmatically resolve those differences and maybe some of the topical differences, based on work done by ontologists, I think you can begin to make some real strides forward in that second approach. The trick, to my mind, and this is what I was mentioning to Pierre-Antoine yesterday, is CDI gives you the structural description. The ontologies give you the semantics. Until you understand the semantics of a concept as it applies to the structure of data, it's much harder to compute with it. Right? And so I think part of our challenge is to figure out how do we take domain ontologies, connect those to a CDI description of the structure, figure out how to harmonize the structure, and then begin to add value to the process of semantic harmonization. But I think the missing link has really been the sort of CDI structural component. I don't know what other people's views on that are, but I think to meaningfully begin to solve that problem, the structure is not enough. Right? You have to get into the mapping the vocabularies programmatically and doing some other clever AI kind of stuff. I don't know if any of you have a response to that. But
may I
yes,
mention? Please. Yeah, when I hear you, Arafan, the link between the domain ontologies and the DDI structural definition, to make this, as you mentioned, it's never like straightforward. It really reminds me of the definition of context in the case of JSON LD from the expanded to the compact form. Is there something like some additional information in the between that would be applied in a specific context for this structural form? Because we know why we use it.
I like the idea, Edward. I was wondering, watching Pierre-Antoine's presentation, about what the connection there was. Whenever you say context, that's a lot of what we're talking about, right? I don't know, do you have a comment on this? Because you have to say it to the mic if you do.
Yes and no, I think. The general idea of the context is indeed to make this mapping between, let's say, structural elements of the JSON file and semantic elements of an ontology. So in that sense, yeah, I agree with Edward's remark. What's not in the context, and what I noticed is a misconception of many people new to JSON LD, is that the context is not a schema. The context is not prescribing any structure. It's just taking what it finds and turning that into meaningful RDF stuff. So I think that there's an interesting and open question here, how a JSON LD context could be linked to a JSON schema in that particular example. So really that would make the full bridge between the structural description on the one hand, which is the schema, and the semantic description on the other hand, which is the ontology. So yes, some of the links are here, some of them are still missing, I think, but
I mean, it's interesting because within CDI, what you have is a simple thing. You have a field that says, here's a value that's from a classification, and here's the classification. And go look at that version of that thing, and that's where we're getting the codes or whatever the values are. And that's really old school, and not, I think, as sophisticated as what you're doing with the JSON LD context. I think it's a little different, though, because in our model, we're pointing out the places where these references become applicable. That does not speak to how you manifest them or resolve them, or particularly use them in an integration scenario. Anyway, I don't know how far down this particular rat hole we want to go right now, but I think what you said, Knut, is right on. It's like, are people going to do this? And will they do it if it's not practically, I mean, this 80% figure, can we get it down even to 60%? That's a huge win for people.
I think there are some in between, as always. Yeah, if I see our data users, which are matching data sets from persons and households, and I see how they sometimes don't succeed in. Yeah, and there, we as data producers, we know the relations. Yeah, and I think our knowledge can be transferred to those users in a technical way, yeah, so they don't make errors by merging these kind of data sets. And if I'm looking at other data sets or other data producers, like the National Educational Panel study in Germany, they have pupils in classrooms, in schools, and so on. Such kind of relations which could be implemented in a traditional relational database, and then if you use them, you don't make errors. Yeah. This sort of relations are well understood. Yeah, and you could implement this kind of information, yeah, but and I would say, okay, this should be done, yeah, but I'm a little skeptical on doing more stuff like this. I had a discussion with people who are wanted to build a research data infrastructure and include geographic information. Yeah? And they said, oh, you at the SUB, you have people in households, and the households can be localized, sure. Yeah, and you have some kind of geographic information, and one could match this geographic information with, I don't know, weather data or so. If the people are more happier if the sun is shining, yeah. Such kind of analysis. But if you attach the geographic information to the SUB at all, yeah, we have information from Germany. That's not enough. Yeah, we would have to tell the users our respondents are located in households where we have which have addresses. Yeah? That's the relevant thing, yeah? And that becomes tricky, yeah? Because you have to address the appropriate level of information. if you want to do it automatically.
So we need to look at also some other examples, I think, because what you're talking about in some ways are the classic social science examples. I have populations. We had a very interesting experience working with the OMOP, because you're looking at clinical data. There's no sampling methodology. It's not a study. It's people visiting hospitals and the administrative records that result. And you mine those for data, and OMOP is all about capturing that data. And then we're starting to introduce longitudinal surveys and people tracked across time, repeat cross-sectional stuff mostly, and trying to merge those into meaningful data sets for researchers. And you run into all kinds of problems. And they have cohorts. They define cohorts out of the clinical data, and a lot of those are probabilistic cohorts. You get into a really severe mismatch. And you have to do some clever things to resolve that. I think that project is figuring out how to do it, but it's not been easy, because fundamentally the domain has a practice that doesn't align with the social science practice. But I don't think those are simple problems, Knut, but I do think they're worth looking at. I mean, you mentioned geography as the basis of climate data, but then you get the Helmholtz example we looked at, the observations are being made at specific depths at specific spots in the ocean, and they're taking salinity readings and temperature readings and stuff like that. What do you do with that? You know, how do you mix that with somebody's household? Not that that would be meaningful, but I mean, the challenges are I think, pretty complex. I don't know what to do with all of that. I'd like to bring this back a little bit to the original topic, which is implementation guidance. What do you think we can usefully, I'm hearing people say, okay, we should focus on the business case a little bit and making the case for doing this. I get that. What do implementers need to know? Do we start from your boss told you to implement this spec? How do you define the community profile? Do we start further back with selling your organization on the use of this? I mean, I outlined what I thought was a very broad scope for this work. Which parts of that do we focus on this week? That's really the question. And I mean, I feel like making the business case for making data integratable might or might not be something we want to focus on. Karsten?
Yeah, I had the impression that this kind of you asked me earlier, it's you want to be interoperable. I mean, that's not the question that Sester is asking. Yes, of course we want to be interoperable. It's more on why is CDI the right way to do it. Yeah, I don't think we should talk about why we should be interoperable. I think this goes beyond what we could, I don't think that's the point. And at least for Sester, that's not the question. Of course we must be interoperable. But for us the question is CDI the right answer, or should we just tell all our service providers ditch DDI and go to open air format directly, because that's what EOSC is asking for in the end anyways. There are good reasons not to, but but that's one of the suggestions that came up. Well, if all Sester cares about is getting data into EOSC and this has to go through an open air format, why tell the service providers to go to lifecycle for only the reason that you then convert it to open air? And that's a valid question.
How do you spell future-proofing? Future-proofing, I'm joking. I mean, open air is kind of a thing of the past and doesn't cross domain boundaries super well. Open air is very impressive, but it's not designed for data either. It's really designed for publications, right?
Yeah, but they're building the big metadata framework.
I do understand that. We did talk to them.
To me, the problem is this constant obsession with catalogues. I mean, going back to first principles, we do need to explain why you should do DDI CDI rather than something else, because a lot of our service providers will say, well, I am interoperable, I've got an OAI feed, I put codebook on there, what's in this for me? And I think that the critical difference is, I'm just looking at there's something, I just got an email this morning about the multilingual corpus of survey questionnaires, which has got, saying 366 questionnaires. And as soon as you click on it, the first thing you do is get referred to at least 7 or 8 different websites upon which you can download multiple SPSS files. So that to me isn't real interoperability. So I think, you know, catalogues are clearly important for discovery, but the important thing is how can you enable runtime subsetting of data sets, variable selection, linkage of data sets, you know, what are the mechanics of doing that under the hood, and catalogues, and, you know, something like the Clarin switchboard, which is basically just a file format converter, that's getting nowhere near addressing that problem.
The thing we like to say, this is more of a codata thing, is that everybody talks about FAIR, they talk about the F and the A, and mostly the F is, oh, I can discover it, it's FAIR. Yeah, what about the other 3 letters? And what we say about DDI, CDI is it's really more about the I and the R. It's about the heavy lifting at the end. And, you know, people should be afraid. I mean, I'm afraid. But the problem is it's complicated, and we need a solution. And so I feel like that's been the focus of DDI, CDI, way beyond things like OpenAir, which are just catalog formats. I mean, the other big question for me is, okay, in an era of schema.org and Google dataset search, are catalogs really the answer? It's a way to publish schema.org with dataset descriptions, sure, but it's not the only one. And is there a paradigm shift? Is there a decentralization of that information that's possible now that the search engines are giving you more granular and potentially better discoverability of data? Say that into the mic, please.
Sorry. We know from user surveys that our users at the UK Data Archive tend to use Google search more than they use our catalogue. And it's hard to say, but Google provides more accurate targeted results.
Okay, we'll have to delete that from the recording. No, but that's a reality, right? I mean, so what I'm hearing you say, though, is that some explanation of that up front probably makes sense. We don't have to make the business case around interoperability, I agree, but we need to talk about FAIR and why getting beyond discovery and cataloging is important. That's
Like you said before, Arafan, putting a PID on your data set is not the end of the matter as regards accessibility and findability.
okay, so Karsten.
I mean, one possibility of why CDI is the good answer is also maybe it's the easiest way of getting codebook data interoperable. I mean, that's the technical side of why use CDI. I mean, it's not just because it's the better standard than OpenAir or OpenAir is no longer relevant. It's more, for us, this is the natural step because we have the codebook data and this is how it makes sense.
When I think about that comment from an implementation guide perspective, this is sort of what I was getting at with the functional requirements, is what, within a community, you have to look at what your metadata holdings are and how to translate that into something that will become more interoperable becomes the question. But I think we can lead people to those questions in a methodology, and then look at Fuji. I mean, I think Fuji was not intended for what it's subsequently been used for. People said, oh, it's a generic way of telling if I'm fair. Yes and no, but I feel like a lot of people's experience with it, they could say, oh, this is nonsense because it wasn't actually designed for what they're trying to do with it. I think we need to lay out what we are expecting people to ask their communities to do around FAIR and what role CDI plays in that. That's kind of what I'm hearing from your comment, and I think that's right. I don't know exactly where to take this. I guess the next step would sort of be to try to look at, of all the possible topics we could cover in an implementation guide, what are the things we want to choose to work on this week? We're going to have some other people joining this group. Marta is from Statistics Estonia, so she has a little bit more of an official statistics perspective on this, and they have some I think different views on this as well. And then we have some other people who will be joining the group who may have their own ideas as well. But I think maybe that's a next activity. Hilda. Oh.
see. Yeah, Doug says, is the real Google tool of interest not Google data set search, but rather data comments?
Could well be. Darren, do you have an answer to that question? Doug's saying it's not the real Google tool of interest, not Google data set search, but rather data commons.
No, I was talking about Google, just straight vanilla Google search.
Okay, Doug, Darren's saying that he meant both, I think.
Yeah, actually I was just referring to vanilla Google search rather than data search particularly. I think that the way that Google harvests our catalog metadata pages and has a better algorithm than Apache Solr. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, and actually, I really resonate with that point. I see that with a lot of communities that are attempting this, and I think it's an interesting question about then how does a group like that foster engagement, right? You know, what are the value adds that you can really offer? Is it just making things even better discoverable in Google? That seems kind of sad, but maybe that means that we need to think more about provenance and representation of authority and things like that. But Google also has another project beyond. I mean, there's the Google core, search, and then there's Google dataset search, right? But there's also data commons, which is going out and actually pulling data and aligning it to their own kind of normalized data model, right? And part of what they're doing there is this kind of alignment from their source schemas to their schema, right? So this is very proprietary, or not proprietary so much, I mean, it's all open source, but it's their approach to it. And it strikes me in some ways that what they're doing as Google and data commons is really what we would like to have as a capability, as a generic capability, maybe facilitated by something like CDI, right? So
That's very interesting, Doug. When I was working with STMX years ago, we met with some people from Google, and this is before when they were first thinking about the data set, what is now dataset search, okay? And we were asking them, we showed them a sort of fairly rich information model for aggregate data, which is a lot of government data, honestly. It's a data of interest. And they said, well, the only data we really care about is data that drives hits for Google advertising. That's our business model. They were really straight with us about that. And I think you're right to say that this is about the capability and not about the proprietary sort of application of it. Because at the end of the day, people care about where to move so they can find a job, where to move so their kids have a better education. There are questions that people care about that drive hits, but a lot of research questions aren't on that list, right? And a lot of important data isn't in high demand, therefore does not drive significant quantities of hits, therefore does not sell advertising. To provide that functionality in a non-proprietary way is maybe the goal here, like you say. That's worth thinking about, but I don't know what the answer is going to be, right? CDI as a standard might facilitate that, sure. How do you make it happen in a decentralized way? I mean, what are your thoughts on making that a reality, I guess? Do you convince the UN to do it?
I mean, I would say about Google Data Commons, the first observation I'd have is that if they're harvesting data, they're harvesting open data, and certainly social sciences. I mean, there's a cliche that anything that's free and accessibly open isn't very useful data. So, the majority of useful data in social sciences is behind some kind of access wall. So I think Google's will do what they do very well, I'm sure, but they can't get around this problem of not having some kind of secure federated infrastructure in there.
But there's an answer for that, Darren. There always has been. The metadata is not private, just the data. And if people know the data exists and find it and say, oh, I can use this to integrate, then they'll bother to apply for access, right?
But I think going full circle, I think what we were saying before is that there's too much emphasis on the metadata and the catalog side of things, because, to be honest, that's the easy side of things. What we're talking here about with CDI potentially is unlocking the data rather than the metadata.
I meant the metadata at the granular level, variable level metadata. There's things I cannot discover about even open data today that would cause me to realize its high value.
But then again, don't assume that all metadata is open because it's just metadata. There are sensitive data sets that we have where we wouldn't show the frequency stats, which you might consider as kind of standard open metadata. So metadata does have levels of sensitivity and access just like data.
No, it should all be open and free.